And for our final story for this edition of the Rolling Stone, mea culpa, I have to say right at the beginning, because it is not, in fact, a story. It is a memorial, as it were, and a rumination, in a sense, because this August marks the 75th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which ended the Pacific War in World War II between the US and the Imperial Japanese. August 6th was the 75th anniversary of the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. August 9th was the 75th anniversary of the dropping of the bomb on Nagasaki. And as is usual, as always happens this time of year, the same debate came up between historians, academic and professional, amateur, armchair, anyone who has a platform of any kind, which basically means anyone today. Everyone did what has now become traditional and threw out their 2 cents over whether or not the dropping of the bombs was morally justified or not. Did the US do the right thing in ending the war that way? Or did it actually commit a moral atrocity? Did President Truman, commit, in fact, a war crime when it dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And as usual, like I said, everyone has divided into their 2 camps, because in a question like this, there are really only 2 camps that you can be a part of. Yes or no. And this year, interestingly enough, there actually was a very good essay in the no camp, written by Professor Joseph E. Capizzi, who is an ordinary professor of moral theology and executive director of the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. And he wrote a piece entitled Hiroshima and the Easy Thing to Do, published August 5th at the Public Discourse, which is a great website, FYI. I'm not going to read the entire piece here because we'd be here all day. But Professor Capizzi, the main thesis of his essay is that saying today that the US should not have atomized Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not an easy thing to do. He is responding to people on the other side, people who say that dropping the bombs was morally justified. Their argument that it's very easy for people in the no camp to say today, 75 years removed from the decision and the war itself, it's very easy for people to say that we shouldn't have dropped the bombs. Should not have dropped the bombs at all, which is actually a point that Douglas Murray, who is a writer for the UK Spectator, he made that argument in a piece for the UK Telegraph. Okay, talking about the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he said, well, it's very easy for us today to say, well, people in the past, they shouldn't have done that. They should have done this instead. And Murray's point was perhaps a little historical humility would be a good thing to have today, because one of the chief errors of our time, of the 21st century, particularly in the West, is that we are so advanced from the people from the past. We are so much more advanced. We're so much more knowledgeable. We're so much more tolerant. We're so much more empathetic towards other people. And we just know so much more that we can stand in perfect judgment of the past and all of their actions. Murray was saying, that doesn't work that way. Because if you don't have the historical humility, bad things are going to happen. Capizzi actually inadvertently addresses that. And I say inadvertently because Capizzi's piece in the Public Discourse was published before Douglas Murray's piece in the UK Spectator. Because Capizzi says it is not an easy decision, even today, to say that the atomic bombs should not have been dropped, because people who say they should not have been dropped are admitting that there would have been dire consequences for not doing so. There would have been major consequences for not dropping the bombs and the war continuing for God knows how long. But Capizzi says that's the price that you pay for having moral principles. Because the whole point of having moral principles is to follow them, regardless of the consequences that happen to you. Because moral principles, they're not a free-for-all. They're not a get-out-of-jail-for-free card. When you have moral principles, there are consequences, because there are things you cannot do, even if everyone is telling you to do them. There are things that you have to do, even when everyone is telling you, oh, for the love of Pete, don't do those things. That's really going to hurt you, your career, your reputation, etc. And so Capizzi's point is that, and as well, because he says, or he very much implies, it's the old line here when you start talking about moral principles, because if you're only willing to have them, and you're only willing to pay the price for having those principles when the price is low, but then when the price gets too high, or when you say, oh, well, this is a good reason for ditching those principles, then you really don't have moral principles at all. You don't have a code by which you live. You have guidelines instead, like Captain Barbossa tells Keira Knightley in the first Pirates movie. And I agree with that. I agree with that. Because morality is one of those things that when you know what is right and what is wrong, then, no, you cannot eject the principles. You cannot say, we'll ignore them this time around, and then next time we'll follow them. Or, my gosh, we can't do this because look at all the things that will happen if we just sort of ignore those moral principles right now. Doesn't work like that. Augustine of Hippo once famously said that you cannot achieve good ends by doing evil things, okay? You cannot commit evil in order that good can come from it. It doesn't work that way. So I agree with Capizzi when he puts, when that is his point. The problem, however, is that so many people in the no camp, the people who say that the atomic bomb should never have been dropped, they not only never really present an alternative to what could have been done. They never actually say that. Now, Capizzi tries. Capizzi quotes G.E.M. Anscombe, who was a very prominent philosopher in the first half of the 20th century. Actually, in the 20th century, G.E.M. Anscombe, she was a very, very, very prominent, very famous, very good philosopher, modern philosopher. And Anscombe condemned the droppings of the bomb. She said that it was a failure of imagination on the part of President Truman and the U.S. High Command, that if these people had actually used their imagination, if they had said, nope, we cannot use the atomic bombs, we are morally bound not to use the bombs, then their imaginations would have opened up and they would have figured out a way to end the war. Capizzi quotes Anscombe saying that and gives his assent to that. But again, Capizzi and everyone else in the no camp, they never actually say an actual alternative. They never present an alternative. And it might be pointed out that neither did Anscombe. She didn't present an alternative either. All she said was it was a lack of imagination. Just have more imagination and it would have worked. You could have found a morally appropriate way of ending the war. So that's one problem with the no camp. Another problem with the no camp is that they never really give you the entire historical picture. All the essays that I've read, and I've read quite a few by now over the years, of people who say that Hiroshima and Nagasaki never should have been bombed, they never present the full historical story. For example, they'll say that Japan was on the verge of surrendering anyway, which is true, except for the fact that Tokyo at that point, the Japanese government, they weren't looking for a surrender. They were looking more for an armistice. They just wanted a ceasefire between themselves and the U.S. in the hopes that they could recuperate their losses, build back their strength, and then continue with their expansion. Okay, while also still maintaining a lot of the territory that they took from China, for example. People in the no camp will say that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were civilian centers. They were cities. They weren't military targets. So targeting them was obviously evil in and of itself, compounded by the fact that it was probably done simply to avenge Pearl Harbor, what started World War II for the United States, the sneak attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor. This was comeuppance for the Japanese. Well, that unfortunately does not take into account two important facts. First, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were military cities. Okay, let me read you a quote that Professor Robert A.J. Gagnon put up on Facebook in regards to this topic. Hiroshima was a city of considerable military importance. It contained the 2nd Army headquarters, which commanded the defense of all southern Japan. The city was a communications center, a storage point, and an assembly area for troops. To quote a Japanese report, probably more than 1,000 times since the beginning of the war did the Hiroshima citizens see off with cries of "Banzai!" the troops leaving from the harbor. Nagasaki had been one of the largest seaports in southern Japan and was of great wartime importance because of its many and varied industries, including the production of ordnance, ships, military equipment, and other war materials. So there's that fact. These were not just cities filled with civilians, women, children, old people, and that was it. No, these were military targets. What they also don't mention, what people in the no camp also don't mention, is that the American High Command had been warning the Japanese government that if they did not surrender, if they did not unconditionally surrender, then some of their cities were going to be dealt a destruction the likes of which the world had never seen. Furthermore, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they were 2 cities on a list of 9 cities, okay? The U.S. High Command had a list of 9 potential targets for the dropping of the atomic bombs. All 9 of those cities received flyers that were dropped onto those cities by American bombers, written in Japanese, which told the citizens of those cities, in no uncertain terms, get out. Get your family out. Get your old people out. Leave immediately because your city is on a list for utter destruction. Get out while you can. So we actually had the common courtesy to warn our enemies that you might be destroyed. Your city might be destroyed. This was not a sneak attack on a civilian population. This was a military target. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were military targets. And the citizenry were warned to get out. Get out while you can. People in the no camp will also say that the U.S. could have just demonstrated the destructive power of the atomic bomb. Told the Japanese, okay, watch Mount Fuji on this day, which is the highest mountain, the tallest point in Japan. Or look out over, the bay. We're going to demonstrate the awesome power that we command now. Problem is, I think that at the time, August 1945, there were only, I want to say there were only 3 or 4 atomic bombs total. Okay, we were not mass producing them, stockpiling them. It was like, we make what we need right now, and then we don't make any more. And by the way, the U.S. only started making atomic bombs because Albert Einstein earlier in the decade had actually told the White House at that point, FDR, that Hitler and his scientists were looking to create atomic weapons. And so the US, before the nuclear war between the US and the USSR, there was the atomic war between Nazi Germany and the Third Reich and the United States. So there were very few bombs. And what people in the no camp forget to say is that there was no guarantee that the bombs were going to work. There were plenty of atomic tests where the bombs didn't go off. They were duds. Because, again, the technology was still rudimentary at that time. And so what the no camp forgets is that if the US High Command had made a big deal about this new massive weapon that the US had and told the Japanese that they were going to receive a demonstration of that power and nothing happened, they would have been determined to fight even harder. They would have been determined to fight even harder, which they would have. I mean, here it is again. The fact that Japan was on the verge of surrendering, I don't buy, because even after Nagasaki, the second city, even after it was nuked, the Japanese government, the war party, which still had a lot of power and influence, were saying, we cannot surrender, we will not surrender, we will continue to fight. And it was only when Emperor Hirohito actually stepped in and stopped being a ceremonial figurehead like the emperor had been now for centuries, when he stepped in and evoked his divine status as the son of heaven and said, no, I am ordering all Japanese soldiers, all Japanese men and women to stop fighting. That's when the war ended. It wasn't because the government surrendered. It was because Emperor Hirohito basically told his people, we're stopping. And that's it. I'm cashing in that I'm the emperor right now in this circumstances. Because what emperor, what good emperor, which by all accounts, the little that I've read, Hirohito was, who wants to see his country destroyed? Who wants to see his people killed, atomized, literally? So that's where we are. That's sort of where we are. The no camp is right that there are moral principles and that you cannot simply erase them when it's inconvenient to you. But the no camp, what the no camp does is that it does not give us the entire picture. It does not give us all the circumstances, which, again, we have to know the circumstances in order to know whether these immoral principles apply here or not. To give a very classic but a very simple example, it's wrong to steal, obviously. However, if you steal a loaf of bread in order to feed your starving child, then that is very different. That is a worlds different than breaking into a bank and stealing $100,000 simply because you want to be rich. Okay? They're both acts of stealing. They're both different. And we all intrinsically know that they're different. If you want my 2 cents of the issue, gang, before I wrap things up, I would say that the dropping of the atomic bombs was a terrible event, that it was absolutely horrible, but that given all of the circumstances that had happened and given everything that the U.S. tried to do in order to minimize the loss of life of citizens in those cities, then you've got to put me into the yes camp. And that's really what going forward in the future, I hope that we can all do. Because the real lesson of this debate, the endless debate over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is that the real lesson of the debate is that there are moral principles and you have to have them. But you can't make a sound and just moral decision unless you have all the data. You can't cook the data. You can't leave out this piece of information, this piece of information, this piece of information in order to win the argument and to say, these principles apply here, when circumstances actually might dictate that it's not quite the situation that we were told. Anyway, that is my thoughts on this 75th anniversary of the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And with that, I am going to wrap things up, gang. Have a great week, and I will talk to you soon. Ciao.